We are now going to start our lecture on some of the major theories we'll be covering in child development. This is quite a long lecture. It would normally take me a couple class periods to go through, so it's going to be several videos because there are a lot of theorists and theories that we're going to be drawing on for the rest of the semester. So first off, we're going to talk about some of the different theoretical perspectives in psychology. There's several different approaches to psychology and development. The first is psychodynamic. This sees human functioning based upon the interaction of drives and forces within the person, particularly unconscious, and between the different structures of the personality. So the psychodynamic theorists are like Freud or Erikson. So they believe that behavior is based on almost unconscious desires and things like that. So we would use psychodynamic perspective in therapy or clinical settings. That's where you see it the most often. The second perspective is behavioral. This is concerned with how environmental factors called stimuli affect observable behavior, called the response. So this has to do with conditioning. You see this in behaviorists, so we already talked a little bit about Pavlov and Skinner, things like that. That behavior comes from reinforcement and punishment. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. The next perspective is cognitive. This explores areas such as memory, attention, perception. It focuses on the physiological processes in the brain. So neuroscience comes at it from this perspective. And this perspective evolved from early philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. And we'll talk about a couple of cognitive theorists in this lecture. Next is humanistic. This is the perspective that emphasizes the study of the whole person, otherwise known as holism. So humanistic psychologists look at human behavior not only through the eyes of the observer, but through the eyes of the person doing the behaving. They believe that you have to look at the whole person. You can't really isolate one aspect of behavior. So they focus on things like free will and self-actualization. If you've learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he's a humanistic perspective. Next is evolutionary. Brain and behavior evolved to solve problems encountered by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. So our behavior likely evolved because it is adaptive. So things that we do, we probably do because somewhere in our evolutionary history, we needed that behavior in order to survive. And last is biological. So this is focused on DNA, genetics. They believe behavior is inherited and has an adaptive purpose. So this perspective really focuses on hormones and neurotransmitters, and this led to the development of psychiatry, which is using medication to help behavior. It deals with switching the neurotransmitters in the brain. So in this course, we're going to deal mostly with the cognitive, humanistic, and evolutionary perspectives, but we'll talk briefly about some of the others. So first, let's talk about some of the psychodynamic theories. The most famous is probably Sigmund Freud. What you probably learned from his theory are the ideas of the three parts of your personality. There's the id, which is your subconscious part, your primal desires. There's the ego, that's like the personality that you show to people. And your superego, which is like your social consciousness, how you fit into society and your culture. He also had a theory of development called the theory of psychosexual development. I don't cover this in this course because Freud has largely been discredited, and he's not my favorite theorist, but everyone should be familiar with him. If you're interested in this theory, go ahead and look it up. The only reason I really cover him is because he was incredibly influential, and his work helped create a new generation of psychologists, like the next theorist that we are going to talk about extensively. His name is Erik Erikson. So his theory is about psychosocial development. He was interested in this, meaning this is how we relate to the social world. Erikson was strongly influenced by Freud, and he developed his own theory of psychosocial development. You cannot study human development without learning about Erikson's theory. It is still everywhere. So he believed that at different ages we go through a developmental crisis. So this is what drives development. You have a crisis, and the resolution of that crisis is what drives your development. So he thought that each stage of life is marked by its own primary developmental crisis. You could experience each crisis at any stage of life, but every age has a primary one. So he divided the lifespan into 8 stages, or 8 different crises. We'll be coming back to his theory at each stage of development, but we're only going to look at his stages through adolescence. But here's a brief overview of his theory. So again, 8 stages. So in infancy, they are in trust versus mistrust. Toddlers, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Preschoolers, initiative versus guilt. Elementary school students would be in industry versus inferiority. Adolescence is about identity versus role confusion. Early adulthood is intimacy versus isolation. Middle adulthood is generativity versus stagnation. And late adulthood is ego integrity versus despair. So each of his stages has a conflict in which there's a good outcome and a bad outcome. The crisis listed is just the primary one for that age, even though you could visit them all. Erickson said that the resolution of previous stages influenced the next, but you can revisit them again and again. For example, a teenager's primary crisis is that of identity, but they may also be struggling with autonomy and industry. Again, we'll cover the details of these stages later. Next, we're going to talk about behaviorism. This is the theory that human and animal behavior can be explained in terms of conditioning without appeal to thoughts or feelings, and that psychological disorders are best treated by altering behavior patterns. This theory was king in the mid-century, the 1950s and 60s, and we still feel the ramifications of it today. So we're going to talk about a few of the most famous behaviorists and the 3 major types of behaviorism. So Ian Pavlov was classical conditioning. So there are 2 major types of conditioning, and this is the first. So this is the association between one stimulus and the other. So the most famous one is Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov noticed that dogs started to react to mealtime even before the food had appeared. So he conducted his famous experiment in the early 1900s. So panel 1 shows a dog drooling when food is presented. The dog sees a bowl of food, it starts to drool. Panel 2 shows a bell ringing, no drooling. The dog doesn't care about the bell. The bell means nothing to him. Then in panel 3, this is what Pavlov did in his experiment. He rang the bell every time he gave the dogs food. So the dog came to associate the ringing bell with the food. It got to the point that all it took was the ringing of the bell to cause the dog to drool, even with no food present, seen in panel 4. You can see classical conditioning everywhere. I'm sure you all have some of it. Is there a noise or a smell or an event that always makes you think of something else? You always have associations. There was also an episode of The Office with the Altoids and the computer noise. That was classical conditioning. So it's the association between 2 unrelated things. That is classical conditioning. The next theorist we're going to talk about is John Watson, and this is a famous quote of his. "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and the race of his ancestors." So in other words, Watson really agreed with John Locke that children are essentially born as blank slates and are shaped by their environment. And he truly believed that given any child, he could shape them into anything he wanted them to be. So he was also a proponent of classical conditioning. He was inspired by the observations of Pavlov. He denied mind or consciousness. He believed that behavior was only based on stimulus response. He was a true behaviorist. Everything we are and do is just a product of the stimuli we have received. There is no subconscious, there is no choice. Behavior is entirely explained by stimulus response and then can therefore be changed by stimulus response. So his famous experiment was that of little Albert, which we talked about briefly when we discussed ethics. So Watson took one stimulus, a white rat, and paired it with another stimulus, the loud gong. So at first, little Albert was not afraid of the rat at all. He would pet it and he would be gentle. But then Watson would introduce the rat, and every time the baby reached for it, he would play a loud gong and scare the baby. So little Albert began to associate those 2 things, and eventually he became frightened when he saw the rat, even if no gong sounded, because he associated the white rat with being scared. The association was so deep that anything white and fluffy scared him, not just the rat anymore. Watson used this experiment as proof that classical conditioning worked on humans, not just animals. There were a lot of issues with his research, however, and not just ethical ones. Next, we're going to talk about B.F. Skinner. He used the second type of conditioning called operant conditioning. So unlike Pavlov and Watson, who focused on classical conditioning, Skinner focused on what's called operant conditioning. This is the second type of behaviorism. This is based on the idea of rewards and punishments rather than the associations between stimuli. So Skinner's experiments are pretty famous, and you've probably heard about them. So he was interested in behavior modification. So he wanted to change behavior through the use of punishments and rewards. So he wanted to know if you can shape a particular behavior this way or create a new behavior that wouldn't happen naturally. So to test this, he used something called the Skinner box. You've probably heard of this before in your intro to psychology class. It was an apparatus that had buttons or levers, had an automatic food dispenser, lights, sounds, and a floor that could have an electric current run through it. He had a version for rats and a version for pigeons. So when the animal did something like push a button, it would either be rewarded with food or punished with an electric shock or have the lights and sounds go off in some way. And using this box, he showed he could train the rats and pigeons to do all sorts of things because they would either get a reward for something or they would get punished for something. Like Watson, he believed that children could be shaped into anything just by affecting their environment. So he also has the quote, "Give me a child and I'll shape him into anything." Another true behaviorist. You've probably seen this before. This chart explains the different stimulations that work to modify behavior. So he believed there was reinforcement and there was punishment, and for both of those there was a positive and a negative form. Again, this does not mean good and bad. This means in the mathematical sense, something being added to the environment or something being removed from the environment. So reinforcement is to increase or maintain behavior. You could think of it as a reward of some sort. Punishment is meant to decrease behavior. So a positive reinforcement is adding something to environment in order to increase or maintain the behavior. So maybe if the dog does the trick you want, you give him a treat. That's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is removing something negative in order to increase or maintain the behavior. So for example, maybe you're taking a dog for a walk and you're trying to teach him not to pull, so you're yanking back on the collar every time he pulls on the leash. Well, when the dog stops pulling, he stops getting that yank on his collar. So something that was unpleasant was removed from his environment in order to reward him. That's probably one of the hardest to understand. In the real world, not psychology world, when we use negative reinforcement, we usually mean something bad is happening, some sort of punishment. But in operant conditioning, negative reinforcement is a good thing. It means that you're just taking away something bad. For punishment, a positive punishment is adding an adverse stimulus in order to decrease behavior. So this could be like spanking or spraying a cat with a water bottle. You're adding something they don't like to the environment. Negative punishment is removing something pleasant in order to decrease behavior. So maybe a child misbehaves and they get their phone taken away. That is negative punishment. Something they like is being removed. So Skinner believed that you could shape behavior just using these 4 forms of feedback. We're going to discuss the third form of behaviorism in the next video.